My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 36 years old, and 5 years ago, 3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother told me not to come home. Her exact words were, "You just make everyone uncomfortable this year. Let's not force it." Before I tell you why she said that, or why the same people who shut the door on me would later be calling nonstop, begging me to come back into their lives, you need to understand what kind of family I came from, and what Thanksgiving had always meant in our house. In the Mercer family, holidays were never really about togetherness. They were about appearances, about the photo someone would post, the story someone would tell later about how perfect everything was. My parents were very good at that. My father, Richard, worked in commercial real estate and loved to talk about legacy. My mother, Elaine, was the kind of woman who measured success in table settings and guest lists. My older sister, Claire, fit neatly into that picture. She married young, married well, and gave my parents the kind of life updates they liked to brag about: engagements, promotions, babies, matching sweaters for Christmas cards. Then there was me. I wasn't a disaster. That's important. I didn't drop out of school or get arrested or burn bridges everywhere I went. But I also didn't follow the script. I studied mechanical engineering, not because it sounded impressive at dinner parties, but because I liked solving problems that had clear answers. After college, instead of chasing a corporate ladder, I took a job with a small manufacturing firm that built custom equipment. It paid decently, but it wasn't flashy. There were no titles my mother could repeat to her friends with pride, no obvious milestones to celebrate. From an early age, it was clear that Claire was the one who needed nurturing, while I was the one who was expected to figure it out. If Claire struggled, my parents hovered. If I struggled, my father would clap a hand on my shoulder and say, "You're strong. You'll manage." At the time, I took that as a compliment. It took years to understand it was just a convenient excuse not to show up for me. Thanksgiving was the clearest example of this dynamic. Every year, my mother hosted an elaborate dinner. The guest list was carefully curated: neighbors, coworkers, distant relatives who could be impressed. Claire was always involved in the planning. She'd arrive early, help with decorations, bring her children dressed in coordinated outfits. I usually showed up alone, sometimes after driving several hours from wherever I happened to be working at the time. I was placed at the end of the table, near the kids, close enough to help, but far enough to be overlooked. No one was overtly cruel. That's what made it harder to name what was wrong. It was subtle: conversations that drifted away when I spoke, compliments that came with a faint note of surprise. "You're doing well for yourself," my uncle once said, as if it were unexpected. I learned to keep my answers short, my presence unobtrusive. 5 years ago, everything shifted. That year had been rough for me. The company I worked for had lost a major contract, and layoffs were rumored. I'd ended a long-term relationship that hadn't been good for either of us. I was tired, stretched thin, and for the first time in my adult life, I needed a little emotional support. Not money, not solutions, just the feeling that I belonged somewhere. A week before Thanksgiving, I called my mother to confirm what time I should arrive. Her voice was tight in that polite way she used when she was already annoyed. "Daniel," she said, "this year might be different." She explained that Claire and her husband were hosting some of his colleagues, important people. People who might be investors in his next venture. The house would be full. The atmosphere needed to be just right. She paused, then said it. "Given everything you've had going on, I just don't think it's the best idea for you to come." I remember gripping the phone harder than I realized. "I'm not sure I understand," I said. She sighed. "You've been a little down lately, and Thanksgiving should be positive, uplifting. We don't want any awkwardness." Awkwardness. That was the word she chose, as if my presence alone might sour the room. "So you're telling me not to come," I said carefully. "I'm saying," she replied, "that maybe this year you do your own thing. We'll catch up another time." Another time never came. I spent that Thanksgiving alone in my apartment, eating takeout and watching a football game I didn't care about. I told myself it was fine. People skip holidays all the time, but something in me hardened that day. A quiet realization that if I wasn't useful to the image my family wanted to project, I was optional. After that, the distance grew naturally. I stopped initiating calls. They stopped noticing. Birthdays were acknowledged with texts. Conversations stayed shallow. Claire would occasionally send photos of her kids with captions like, "Wish you were closer," but there was no invitation behind the words, just a performance of sentiment. Meanwhile, my life kept moving. The layoffs came, and I was one of the ones let go. It was scary, but it forced me to take a risk I'd been considering for years. I started consulting independently, helping small factories optimize their processes. It was slow at first, long hours, lots of rejection, but I was good at it, better than I'd realized. Within 2 years, I had more work than I could handle alone. I hired 2 employees, then 3. I didn't announce any of this to my family. Not out of spite, it just didn't occur to me to share. By the time the fifth Thanksgiving rolled around, I was in a very different place, stable, confident, content in a way I hadn't been before. I had friends who felt like family, traditions of my own. The holiday itself had lost its sting. Then, in early October, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her tone was warm, almost eager. "Daniel," she said, "it's been too long. We were just talking about you." We, that was new. She went on to explain that this Thanksgiving would be special, a chance to reconnect, a chance to heal old misunderstandings. "Your father and I would really love it if you came," she said. I didn't answer right away. She filled the silence quickly. "A lot has changed. We've realized how important family is, especially now." Especially now. That phrase stuck with me. I asked what she meant, and she deflected. Said we'd talk when I got there. Said it would mean so much to everyone. Even Claire had mentioned me, apparently. Missed me. Wanted her kids to know their uncle. I told her I'd think about it. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. 5 years earlier, I'd been too inconvenient to invite. Now, suddenly, my presence was important again. Necessary, even. The timing didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a need. What I didn't know yet was how much they needed me, or why they were finally willing to overlook the awkwardness they once used to push me away. That truth would come out soon enough, across a dining table set just as carefully as ever, with smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. After that call, memories I hadn't thought about in years started resurfacing, not all at once, but in fragments. Small moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now, with distance, formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I realized that being told not to come to Thanksgiving wasn't an exception. It was simply the first time my family had said out loud what they'd been implying my whole life. Growing up, Claire and I lived in the same house, ate at the same table, and went to the same schools, but our roles were very different. Claire was celebrated. I was tolerated. When she brought home good grades, they were framed and hung on the refrigerator. When I did well, my father would nod and say, "That's expected." When she cried, the house stopped. When I struggled, I was reminded how lucky I was to have opportunities at all. I learned early not to ask for much, not because I didn't want things, but because wanting things made people uncomfortable. If I needed help with homework, I figured it out myself. If I was upset, I dealt with it quietly. My parents praised me for being low maintenance, not realizing that what they were really praising was my ability to disappear when it suited them. Claire, on the other hand, was encouraged to take up space. Her feelings were discussed openly. Her setbacks were treated as family emergencies. When she decided to change majors halfway through college, my parents rallied around her. When I took an extra semester to finish because I was working 2 jobs, no one mentioned it at all. Thanksgiving dinners reflected this imbalance perfectly. The seating arrangement never changed. Claire and her husband sat near my parents, close to the center of conversation. I was placed wherever there was room. I was often asked to help with dishes or keep an eye on the kids, tasks I didn't mind, but ones that quietly reinforced my role. Helpful, peripheral, replaceable. There was one Thanksgiving in particular that stayed with me. I must have been 28. I'd just completed a major project at work, something I was genuinely proud of. I tried to talk about it at the table, explaining how we'd redesigned a system that cut waste by nearly 30%. Halfway through my sentence, my mother interrupted me to ask Claire about a playdate she was planning for her daughter. The conversation never came back to me. No one even noticed I'd stopped speaking. I remember smiling, nodding, passing the gravy. I remember thinking that this was just how families worked, that maybe I was expecting too much. But now, years later, I could see it clearly. My family didn't dislike me. They just didn't need me. And when I stopped being useful to their narrative, they found it easier to push me out than to adjust their picture of themselves. The 5 years after that lonely Thanksgiving were quiet ones. Painfully quiet at first. I spent a lot of time alone, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to reach out without feeling like I was imposing. Slowly, that changed. Work filled the gaps, then friendships did. People who listened. People who asked questions and waited for the answers. People who noticed when I wasn't okay. I stopped trying to explain myself to my family, stopped sending updates that were met with polite indifference. When my consulting business started to take off, I celebrated with the people who had actually been there, not with those who had only ever shown interest when it reflected well on them. That's why my mother's sudden warmth felt so jarring. It wasn't that I didn't want reconciliation. It was that reconciliation usually comes after reflection, after acknowledgement. This felt rushed, strategic, like an invitation with an agenda. A few days after her call, Claire texted me. It was brief, overly cheerful. "Mom says you might come for Thanksgiving this year. That would be nice. The kids would love to see you." No mention of the year I'd been explicitly excluded. No acknowledgement of the distance that followed. Just an assumption that time had smoothed everything over. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I called a friend of mine, Mark, someone who'd known me long enough to remember how I'd been before and see who I'd become. I told him about the invitation, about the way my mother's voice had changed, about the feeling in my gut that something was off. "What do you want to do?" he asked. That question caught me off guard. For so long, what I wanted hadn't factored into decisions involving my family. I'd gone along, adapted, accepted. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Part of me wants to go, just to see. Part of me doesn't want to reopen anything." "Then go with your eyes open," he said. "Not as the version of you they remember, as who you are now." That advice stayed with me. A week later, my father emailed me. It was unusual. He wasn't much for emails, especially emotional ones. The message was short, formal, almost businesslike. He said it would mean a great deal to him if I came. That family mattered more than anything. That life was too short to hold on to old misunderstandings. Old misunderstandings. As if being told not to come home was a simple miscommunication. Still, I replied that I would attend. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted clarity. I wanted to see if anything had truly changed, or if this was simply another performance, another carefully staged holiday where I played a role that suited them. As Thanksgiving approached, the calls increased. My mother asked about my travel plans, offered to make dishes I liked. Claire sent another text, this one suggesting we put the past behind us. None of them asked how I'd been. Not really. They didn't ask about my work, my life, the years they'd missed. They were focused on the event, not the connection. The night before I left, I packed my bag with an odd sense of detachment. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't hopeful. I was curious. Curious to see what had prompted this sudden desire for togetherness. Curious to see how they would react to the version of me that no longer needed their approval. What I didn't realize then was that my family wasn't reaching out because they'd grown. They were reaching out because something had gone wrong. And in their moment of need, They'd remembered the one person they'd always assumed would quietly step in and fix things. The only question was whether they'd finally understood that I wasn't that person anymore. The drive back to my parents' house took just under 4 hours, the same stretch of highway I'd traveled countless times before. Fields gave way to suburbs, then familiar exits started appearing, each one tugging at memories I hadn't invited. I noticed something strange about myself as I drove. I wasn't rehearsing conversations. I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I felt neutral. That alone told me how much I'd changed. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. Freshly trimmed hedges, seasonal wreath on the door, lights glowing warmly through the windows. It was the kind of scene meant to signal comfort and belonging. 5 years ago, I would have felt a tightening in my chest at the sight of it. Now it just looked like a building. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She smiled wide, arms outstretched, like she'd been waiting behind it the whole time. "Daniel?" she said brightly, pulling me into a hug that felt rehearsed. "You made it." My father stood behind her, nodding, his expression carefully neutral. "Good to see you, son." Claire appeared a moment later, children in tow. She smiled too, the same polished smile she used in family photos. "Hey," she said, "long time." They all acted as if nothing unusual had ever happened, as if I hadn't been excluded, as if 5 years of distance could be erased by good lighting and polite enthusiasm. Inside, everything was immaculate. The table was already set, even though it was the day before Thanksgiving. Place cards neatly arranged. I noticed mine immediately. It was there, positioned at the table, closer to the center than I'd ever been seated before. That alone confirmed my suspicion. This wasn't reconciliation. This was repositioning. Dinner that night was careful, too careful. They asked surface-level questions, listened just long enough to appear interested, then moved on. When I mentioned work, my father's attention sharpened. "Consulting," he repeated. "You're still doing that?" "Yes," I said. "It's grown quite a bit." "How so?" he asked, leaning forward. I gave a brief overview. Nothing flashy, just facts. Clients, expansion, employees. My mother exchanged a glance with him. It was quick, but I saw it. Claire's smile tightened. "Well," my mother said, "that's wonderful. We always knew you were capable." Always knew. I didn't correct her. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and waited for the other shoe to drop. It came the next morning, just not in the way I expected. I was up early, making coffee in the kitchen, when I overheard my parents talking in the next room. They didn't know I was awake. "I'm glad he came," my mother said quietly. "We really need him to be on board." "We need to be careful," my father replied. "He's doing well. We don't want to scare him off." My hand stilled on the mug. Later that day, my uncle arrived. Then an aunt. Then a family friend I barely recognized. The house filled quickly. This Thanksgiving was bigger than usual, louder, more elaborate. It felt less like a family gathering and more like an event. At one point, my father asked if we could talk privately. He led me into his office, closing the door behind us. He gestured for me to sit, then took the chair across from me. "Daniel," he began, folding his hands, "we're very proud of you." I waited. He cleared his throat. "You know the market's been unpredictable. Real estate isn't what it used to be." There it was. He went on to explain that a recent investment hadn't gone as planned, that cash flow was tight, that they were confident things would rebound, but they needed help bridging the gap, just temporarily. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, recognition. "How much?" I asked. He hesitated, then named a number. It was significant, but not impossible, a number that assumed access, familiarity, obligation. "I see," I said. He leaned back, relief flickering across his face. "We knew you'd understand. Family helps family." I stood up. "I need some air," I said. I stepped outside, the cool November air hitting my face. 5 years ago, I would have agreed without hesitation. I would have told myself it was temporary, that it was what families did. That's what they were counting on. What they didn't know was that I'd already decided something the moment I overheard that conversation in the morning. I wasn't there to rescue them. I was there to finally tell the truth. Inside, laughter floated through the windows. The performance continued, but the reckoning was coming. And this time, I wouldn't be the one quietly disappearing to make it easier for everyone else. Continue to next part. Thanksgiving Day arrived, wrapped in all the familiar rituals. The smell of roasting turkey filled the house early, layered with cinnamon and butter and something sweet baking in the oven. My mother moved through the kitchen like a conductor, directing people, adjusting dishes, correcting small details that no one else seemed to notice. Claire hovered nearby, scrolling through her phone, occasionally showing my mother photos of the kids she'd already posted online. Smiles were practiced. Laughter was timed. I watched it all from the edge of the room, coffee cooling in my hand, feeling like an observer at a play I'd seen too many times before. The difference was that this time, I wasn't waiting for a cue. I wasn't wondering where I fit. I already knew. Before we sat down to eat, my mother clinked her glass. "I just want to say how grateful I am that we're all together this year," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "Family is what matters most." There were nods, murmurs of agreement. My father looked at me pointedly, a small smile on his face as if to reinforce the message. Claire glanced over too, her expression unreadable. Dinner itself was loud. Conversations overlapped. Wine was poured generously. At one point, my aunt asked what I'd been up to all these years. Before I could answer, my father jumped in. "Daniel's been doing very well for himself," he said proudly. "Started his own consulting business. Quite successful." It was the most enthusiastic endorsement he'd ever given me. I felt eyes turn toward me, curious, impressed. I smiled politely, kept my response modest. The attention wasn't uncomfortable, but it was telling. 5 years ago, my absence had been preferable to my presence. Now that I had something they valued, I was suddenly worth displaying. Halfway through the meal, my mother brought out a thick folder. She placed it carefully beside my father's plate, then looked around the table. "After dessert," she said lightly, "there's something your father would like to discuss with everyone." My stomach tightened. That was new. Dessert came and went. Plates were cleared. Coffee was poured. The mood shifted subtly, the way it does when people sense something serious approaching. My father cleared his throat. "As you all know," he began, "Elaine and I have been thinking a lot about the future, about what comes next for this family." He spoke about rising costs, about uncertainty, about the importance of sticking together. He talked about investments that hadn't panned out, about plans that needed restructuring. It was framed as a collective issue, a family concern. Then he turned to me. "Daniel has built something impressive," he said, "and we're incredibly proud of him. We think it makes sense for him to play a larger role moving forward." There it was, not a request, a declaration. I felt the room lean in, waiting for my response. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I set my coffee cup down and met his gaze. "I think," I said slowly, "there are some things we need to talk about before we discuss the future." My mother's smile faltered just slightly. "I was told not to come to Thanksgiving 5 years ago," I continued. "I think it's important we acknowledge that." The room went very quiet. "That was a misunderstanding," my mother said quickly. "We've moved past that." "I haven't," I replied. My voice was calm, steady. "And pretending it didn't happen doesn't change the impact." Claire shifted in her seat. "Do we really need to dredge this up now?" she asked. "It's a holiday." "It was a holiday then too," I said. My father frowned. "Daniel, this isn't productive." "I disagree," I said, "because what you're asking for now assumes a closeness that didn't exist when I needed it." I stood and reached into my bag, pulling out a slim folder of my own. Inside were emails, text messages, dates. Not dramatic, just accurate. "This is the message I received," I said, placing a printed page on the table, "telling me not to come, because my presence would make things uncomfortable." My mother's face drained of color. "I'm not bringing this up to punish anyone," I continued. "I'm bringing it up because it matters, because it shaped the last 5 years of my life." Around the table, people exchanged looks. Someone cleared their throat. My uncle stared down at his hands. "You didn't need me then," I said, "and I learned how to live with that. So you don't get to decide you need me now without acknowledging what changed." My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I'm not here to be a solution," I said. "I'm here as a guest. And if that's not acceptable, I can leave." Silence stretched. Finally, my aunt spoke. "I didn't know," she said quietly, "any of this." Neither did most of them, and that was the point. My mother looked like she might cry, but I'd seen that look before. It wasn't remorse. It was loss of control. "We thought you understood," she said weakly. "I understood perfectly," I replied. "I just stopped accepting it. No one asked me to stay. No one asked me to go. I gathered my things and stood, the decision already made." As I walked out the door, the house behind me buzzed with confusion and whispered questions. For the first time, I wasn't the one left wondering what had just happened. I drove away, knowing that whatever they needed from me, they would have to learn to face without my help. And that, finally, felt like peace. I didn't go far that night. I checked into a small hotel just off the highway, the kind of place that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and brewed coffee. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, replaying the evening in my head, not with regret, but with a strange sense of finality. I'd said what needed to be said, calmly, clearly, without apology. That alone felt like a victory I'd waited decades for. My phone buzzed before I'd even unpacked. A text from Claire. "That was unnecessary. You embarrassed Mom and Dad in front of everyone." I stared at the message, then set the phone face down without replying. 5 years ago, being accused of embarrassment would have sent me spiraling, wondering what I could have done differently. Now, it just felt predictable. Their discomfort had always been easier to blame on me than to examine themselves. The next morning, I woke early and drove home. The familiar rhythm of my own city welcomed me back, my apartment, my routine, my life. It felt grounding in a way that house never had. For a few days, nothing happened. No calls, no messages. Silence. Then the calls started. First, it was my mother. She left a voicemail, her tone strained. She said she didn't understand why I'd chosen to air private family matters in public. She said my father was under a lot of stress. She said we needed to talk calmly, like adults. I deleted the message. Then my father called. Twice. Then an email. Longer this time. He framed it as concern. He said I'd misunderstood their intentions, that they'd always believed in me, that family shouldn't keep score. I read it once, then archived it. A week later, Claire called. Her voice was sharper now, the cheer gone. She accused me of being selfish, of holding grudges, of turning my back on family when they needed me most. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Mom?" she demanded. "I do," I said quietly, "because I know what it feels like to be dismissed when you need support." She hung up. Through all of this, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. The difference mattered. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was simply refusing to be positioned as their safety net again. The truth came out gradually, the way it often does. Through relatives who reached out, through pieces of information that slipped during tense conversations. My parents' financial situation was worse than they'd admitted. An investment property had gone under. A loan had been called in early. They were scrambling to cover gaps they'd assumed could be patched quietly, with my help, the way things always had been with other responsibilities they'd shifted onto me over the years. Only this time I wasn't stepping in. At first, there was disbelief, then anger, then bargaining. My mother suggested smaller amounts, temporary support, just until things stabilized. My father hinted at future inheritance, at gratitude that would surely follow. Claire implied that if I didn't help, it would affect how her children saw me. None of it worked. What surprised me most was not their reaction, but my own. I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. For the first time, I could see the pattern without being trapped inside it. I could recognize that what they were asking for wasn't connection. It was rescue. And rescue had always been my role, even when no one called it that. Weeks passed. The holidays came and went. I spent Christmas with friends, laughing over burned cookies and mismatched decorations. It was imperfect and warm and real. No one was keeping score. No one was performing. In January, my aunt called, the same one who'd spoken up quietly at the table. She told me my parents were selling the house, that downsizing was unavoidable now. She sounded tired when she spoke, as if she'd been carrying more than she'd let on. They didn't plan well, she said. They always assumed things would work out. I understood what she meant. Things had always worked out, because someone else had absorbed the cost. This time they were facing it themselves. I wished them no harm. I truly didn't. But I also didn't feel compelled to intervene. Their crisis wasn't my responsibility. It never had been. One evening, months later, my phone rang again. It was my mother. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But something told me this call was different. Her voice was quieter, older. "Daniel," she said, "we miss you." I waited. "I think," she continued, "we didn't realize how much we took for granted." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was closer than she'd ever come. "I'm not ready to pretend nothing happened," I said. "But I'm open to talking, slowly, with honesty." There was a pause. Then, "I understand." Whether she truly did or not, I couldn't say. What I knew was this. The door wasn't closed, but it was no longer wide open either. It had boundaries now. Conditions. Mutual respect. 5 years ago, I was told not to come to Thanksgiving because my presence was inconvenient. This year, I understood something I hadn't before. Belonging isn't about being included when it suits others. It's about being valued even when you don't bring something to the table. I'd built a life where I was valued, where I was chosen, and I wasn't willing to trade that peace for a seat at a table that only welcomed me when it needed something. The months after that call settled into a new rhythm, one that felt steadier than anything I'd known before. I kept my distance, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Contact with my parents became occasional and measured, a short phone call every few weeks. Neutral updates, no financial discussions, no emotional bargaining. They tested the boundaries once or twice, slipping in comments about how hard things still were, how stressful it felt to start over at their age. Each time I listened without stepping in. Each time they pulled back a little more, learning what I had already accepted. Claire went quiet for a long while. I heard about her through others. Her husband's business hadn't rebounded the way they'd hoped. The pressure that once flowed downward toward me had started circulating elsewhere, and she wasn't used to being on the receiving end of it. Part of me felt a twinge of sympathy. A larger part recognized that this, too, was not mine to fix. Spring came, then summer. My work continued to grow. I moved into a larger office, signed a long-term lease, hired another engineer. For the first time, I felt rooted, not because of where I came from, but because of what I'd built. On quiet evenings, I'd cook dinner for myself, sometimes for friends, and marvel at how calm my life felt without the constant undercurrent of obligation. In August, my aunt invited me to her birthday dinner. It was a small gathering, casual, no performances. My parents were there, along with a handful of relatives. I hesitated before accepting, but decided to go. I wanted to see what had changed, if anything. The dinner was polite, careful. My mother hugged me when I arrived, but she didn't cling. My father asked about my work without turning it into a pitch. When conversation drifted toward finances, my aunt steered it elsewhere. No one asked me for anything. That, more than anything, told me they were starting to understand. At one point, my mother pulled me aside. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, "about that Thanksgiving, about what you said." I waited. "I don't think we realized how lonely you felt," she continued. "You never said anything." "I didn't think it would matter," I replied. She nodded slowly. "I see that now." It still wasn't an apology, but it was closer. And for the first time, it didn't feel like she was trying to extract something from me. It felt like she was sitting with her own discomfort instead of handing it off. After that night, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. Invitations came with no expectations attached. Conversations included questions that were actually followed by listening. When I said no, it was accepted without argument. That was new. I didn't rush forgiveness. I didn't rush closeness. I let things develop at a pace that felt safe. Some people mistook that for distance. I saw it as discernment. Another Thanksgiving came around, 1 year after the confrontation. This time, the invitation arrived early. No pressure, no insistence, just an open door. I thought about it carefully before responding. I thought about the man I'd been 5 years ago, sitting alone with takeout and a football game, trying to convince himself that exclusion didn't hurt. I thought about the man I was now, someone who knew exactly what his presence was worth. I said yes. This Thanksgiving was smaller, quieter, no colleagues, no curated guest list, just family. The table was simpler, the food still good, but not extravagant. My place card was there, but it didn't feel symbolic this time. It felt normal. Dinner passed without speeches, without agendas. We talked about mundane things, the weather, travel plans, a movie my aunt had seen. At one point, my father asked for my advice on a minor home repair. Not money, advice. I gave it. He thanked me. Claire's kids climbed into my lap at one point, asking questions, telling stories that went nowhere. Claire watched from across the table, her expression softer than I remembered. When she caught my eye, she smiled. Not the polished smile, a real one. Later that evening, as dishes were cleared and people lingered, my mother sat beside me. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. "So am I," I replied, and for the first time, it was true without qualification. I didn't stay late. I left when I was ready. No one commented. No one guilted me. I drove home feeling light, not because everything had been fixed, but because nothing was being forced. 5 years earlier, my family had told me not to come to Thanksgiving because I didn't fit the picture they wanted to present. 5 years later, they needed me back, but not in the way they'd first imagined. They needed me to show them what boundaries looked like, what accountability felt like, what it meant to earn someone's presence instead of assuming it. The greatest lesson wasn't about them, though, it was about me. About understanding that being needed is not the same as being valued, that belonging built on obligation will always crumble, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to step away until the relationship can stand on something real. I don't know what the future holds for my family. I know there will be missteps. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But I also know this. I will never again shrink myself to fit a table that only has room for me when it's convenient. And that knowledge, hard-earned and quietly held, is something no one can take away. Time has a way of clarifying things once the noise dies down. In the months after that quieter Thanksgiving, I found myself thinking less about what my family had done wrong and more about what I had learned. Not in a philosophical way, but in the practical details of daily life. In how I answered the phone, in how I said no, in how I no longer felt the need to justify my choices to anyone who hadn't earned that explanation. My parents tried, in their own limited way, to adapt. My mother stopped making comments about how often I visited. She stopped framing invitations as obligations. When I declined, she accepted it with a simple, maybe next time. That alone told me she was paying attention. My father became quieter around me, less authoritative, more tentative. He asked questions instead of making assumptions. Sometimes he listened. Sometimes he slipped back into old habits. But the difference was that now I noticed. And when I noticed, I responded accordingly. There was one afternoon, about 6 months later, when my father asked if I could help him review some paperwork. Not money, not a bailout, just documents related to the house they were selling. I hesitated before agreeing, not because I didn't want to help, but because I wanted to be sure of my reasons. In the end, I did it, on my terms. We sat at the kitchen table, going over numbers calmly. When we were done, he thanked me, not performatively, just plainly. That mattered. It showed me that support could exist without sacrifice, that I could offer something without losing myself in the process, that helping didn't have to mean disappearing. Claire reached out more slowly. At first, it was small things. A message on my birthday, a comment on a photo. Then, one evening, she asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. We met for coffee halfway between our cities. She looked tired. Not dramatically so, but in the way people do when the stories they've told themselves start to wear thin. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," she said after a while. "About how things were between us." I waited. Silence had become one of my strengths. "I didn't notice how uneven it was," she admitted. "Or maybe I noticed and didn't question it because it benefited me." "That's honest," I said. She nodded. "I don't expect you to just forgive everything. I just wanted you to know I see it now." I believed her, not because her words were perfect, but because she wasn't asking me to fix anything. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She was simply acknowledging reality. That was enough for now. As the year went on, I noticed another change. Extended family members who had once treated me as an afterthought began including me more naturally. Invitations arrived without subtext. Conversations didn't feel performative. I realized that much of the narrative about me had been controlled by my parents, filtered through their version of events. When that filter cracked, people started seeing me more clearly, but the biggest change wasn't external. It was internal. I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was. I stopped volunteering for emotional labor that wasn't reciprocated. I stopped feeling responsible for managing other people's discomfort. The absence of that constant pressure created space, space to rest, space to enjoy my own life, space to build something that didn't revolve around earning a place. Another Thanksgiving approached, 2 years after the confrontation. This time, I wasn't invited as a symbol or a solution. I was invited because I was family. I accepted without overthinking it. That holiday was unremarkable in the best possible way. No speeches, no agendas, just food, conversation, and an ease that hadn't existed before. I left early again, not because I wanted to escape, but because I was tired, and that was okay. Driving home, I thought about how strange it was that the thing I'd wanted most for years, simple acceptance, had only become possible once I stopped chasing it. Once I proved, first to myself, that I could walk away. 5 years ago, being told not to come to Thanksgiving felt like rejection, and it was. But it was also an unintended gift. It forced me to confront the truth of my role in my family and to decide whether I was willing to keep playing it. Walking away didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. My family needed me back, yes, but not as a financial buffer or a silent fixer. They needed me back as myself, and the only reason that was possible was because I had learned that my presence was optional to me too. I don't tell this story because it has a perfect ending. It doesn't. Relationships are complicated. People change slowly, if at all. I tell it because sometimes the most painful exclusions are the ones that finally teach you where you belong. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do when someone tells you not to come is to listen, and then build a life so full that you never again have to beg for a seat at the table.